Good morning, everyone. So today you and I are going to talk about CSS frameworks. Yes, so let's get into it. Now, for those of you who have been watching a few of my videos about like fetch versus Axios and CSS, or not CSS frameworks, but rather JavaScript frameworks, you may find this a little bit odd. Because I have in previous videos stated, especially in the front-end review I did a while back where we walked through a few of the CSS frameworks out there, I stated that I didn't see any really good reason to start looking into CSS frameworks apart from one specific thing, and I wanted to touch on that specific thing in this video. So my general rule of thumb is, and will be for as long as I am a web developer, or at least I work on the web, that there is a cost benefit to everything that you add to your page. And what do I mean by that? Well, I basically mean that the rule of thumb for the web is less is more. And the reason for that is that the heavier your page, the slower it's going to load, the more resources is required for it to start working. And on a mobile device, for example, that is not a great thing all the time. I actually go as far as to say that speed is almost everything. It's not everything, but it's almost everything. A lot of people will argue and tell me, and this is especially true for designers out there in the world, they will tell me that UX is the most important thing or something of that nature. But I will argue, and I think a lot of designers, at least the ones that I've talked to, they kind of agree with me that speed is UX. One of my favorite websites in the world that kind of illustrates my point is Craigslist. It's an absolutely horrible website. Visually, it looks butt ugly, but it's one of the most popular websites in the world. So I will make a statement, and this is a bold statement. And that statement is that when it comes to design, there is such a thing as good enough. And although that is actually true for speed as well, because I also argue on the other side of the spectrum that there are a lot of people out there who kind of go overboard with optimizations and performance, and these are the sort of people who are really passionate about performance to the point where they will optimize things that are not humanly conceivable to be any different. It's kind of how I describe friends of mine who ask me, okay, what graphics card should I use for my gaming setup? And I say, all right, pick whatever is mid-range to slightly below the high-end range, because the games themselves very rarely require you to have the top-of-the-line stuff, because the top-of-the-line stuff is going to be so much more powerful than what you can perceive or what your requirements are going to be, that there's no reason for you to pay that extra money for the most part. And the same thing goes for performance. What does it matter if you have 60 frames per second across the board on everything that is happening on your web page? Why would you try to optimize that even more? There are more important things to look at in that scenario. So if we have these things in mind and we start talking about CSS frameworks, and we kind of consider that these things are extremely heavy. The best example I have is that it used to be the case that Bootstrap, for example, you found Bootstrap on every single page, at least a few years ago. And to some degree, that is actually true today as well. There are a lot of them. Material UI is also very popular, like the CSS frameworks that have that going. And so what I'm here to tell you is that there is a big downside to using them, but there's also a benefit to them. And let me just define from my perspective when one makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, when you should use a CSS framework and when you shouldn't. Because I think that there are really good use cases for when to use them. Now, It used to be the case that Bootstrap, and this is still true, this is absolutely horrible. It used to be the case that Bootstrap was something you used because responsive designs were so difficult to achieve. Literally, people would include the entire Bootstrap framework to just do columns and rows and responsive layout. It's very much the same type of problem we had with jQuery and people simply including jQuery to get the Ajax call. And to me, that is the same thing as, I don't know, it's like trying to water your plants with a fire truck when you really only need a hose. It's virtually the same thing. So that used to be the case, and it is still on a lot of websites that I visit these days. I can actually see that they're still using Bootstrap, and I can look at the webpage and I can see, hey, they are just using the actual column layouts. Now, there are ways around this today, thanks to the amazing pre-compilers like SAS and LESS and so forth. We can actually just extract the things that we kind of need to do the column layout. But I want to go one further, and I want to say that with Flexbox and CSS Grid, which is almost supported in everything now, you don't need this stuff anymore. It's much more valuable to you to actually learn these two standards, because if you do, you can get all of the benefits and more than what Bootstrap and these frameworks will give you. If you have no other reason to use a CSS framework apart from the responsive layout, start using Flexbox and start using CSS Grid and I raise my finger and I say, with the exception that if you have to support extremely old browsers, you might want to look at other solutions. Now, there are polyfills for CSS Grid, for example, so even then maybe Bootstrap isn't the way to go. But if you're stuck with it, you're stuck with it. I'm not saying that you have to migrate or anything like that, but I would like you to have if you're doing something from scratch today, just look at Flexbox and CSS Grid, because the standard will allow you to ship less stuff. The less stuff you ship, the faster your page is going to load. And for the most part, you're going to use a fraction, as I said, of the actual framework, and all that other stuff is just going to be excess weight to your page. Now, with that defined, let's talk about when a CSS framework makes a lot of sense and where I would every single day of the week use it. The perfect use case, as I can see it, is in two scenarios for a CSS framework. The first and foremost thing is, do you have the time? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when you start building an application, let's say that you are creating, say, an internal tool of some sort. You're creating something where performance actually doesn't matter all that much. You're not, maybe it's as I said, an internal tool, or maybe it's a small web page or something that you're just playing around with. It doesn't really matter. If it's not something where you literally need to squeeze as much performance as possible, and usually the things that needs a lot of performance are user-facing things that gives you revenue or gives you a value to your users. Those things need to be as quick as you can make them with reasonable in a reasonable amount of time, of course, not going crazy with that either. So that's a really good scenario for a CSS framework, when you need to get speed for just getting something up, so you don't have to spend a lot of time doing a custom design. Because although most of the time when you're working for a company, they're going to want you to do a custom design. Very few companies just use something like Bootstrap with the default styles and then that's the end of it. Usually they want you to style it in their specific manner, and if you're already doing that, then that doesn't really make sense to me to use. Then you're already forced to put in the sort of work that is required to make a fully customized design, which is not, as I said, the best use case for something like Bootstrap or a CSS framework. But what CSS frameworks gives you is a very nice starting point. And apart from the use case where you go for speed, where you just want something very quickly up on the page and that looks reasonable, there is actually another use case, which is, and I think it's absolutely genius. It's this use case that We have at my company, for example, I didn't tell my bosses this when I started, and I didn't tell my designer either, but I kind of figured that out when I saw how they had structured things. So we use Material UI, or well, the CSS framework, the React flavor of that CSS framework. And what's beautiful about that is that as a startup or a small company, you don't really have the sort of resources to put in, not in the beginning at least, you don't have the time or the money that it takes to make a really beautiful custom design, because good design and UX takes a lot of time and a lot of skill, and you need people to really focus on it. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, oh yeah, I'm just going to outsource that to a consultancy. And yeah, that might be useful in the very, very beginning, but ideally you want something that is consistent. Like we are talking today about design systems, atomic designs, and creating basically molecules and these different UI components. That's the trend that's going forward today. So component libraries, for example, all of this stuff is highly popularized today, and for a very good reason, because what's beautiful about it is that if you have a design library, you can keep things consistent. You don't have to redesign things, and you don't have you get finished components, and over time you can actually move much quicker with a design system as opposed to creating things from scratch every single time. Makes sense, right? And that's where CSS frameworks come in. If you have something like Material UI that's as your standard, like as your finished components, and you only move within that design system, you can actually get something that looks amazing very, very quickly, and you don't have to spend a lot of energy or money or time on it. And honestly, I think that the double whammy on this is that since Google is pushing the standardization of UI experiences, you will actually get an even bigger user value, because a lot of people are using the style system in other applications. So your application will naturally feel more intuitive to the user, which is extremely powerful. So the beauty of this is that although it adds more weight to your web page, it actually saves you a lot of time in the beginning of things, and it gives you a application that feels much higher quality much quicker. And that is a very powerful use case. You should not underestimate it. I honestly think that in that scenario, the speed of the page, that's a good trade. It's a very good trade, because although maybe you kind of have to do some trickery to kind of make up for the loss of performance from using such a framework, the benefit to the rest of your development process is going to be massive. You're going to be able to create really nice looking UI layouts in a matter of moments, as opposed to having to build everything from scratch. And if you don't need to customize things, this is a massive benefit, and I highly encourage you to use CSS frameworks. So yeah, those are my 2 cents on the matter. I think that CSS frameworks should, if you don't have time, basically, if you don't have the type of resources in order to make something absolutely beautiful and really make a high quality feeling product, then CSS frameworks are great. They will give you that basically for free. But if you're making a completely custom design, and you're already putting in the work of making something very branded or very specific to some type of company where the requirements are that they want things to be very custom, then don't use them. So that's the mindset. CSS frameworks, awesome for startups or someone who wants to get something beautiful very, very quickly. Don't use them if you're already putting in the work. That's it. Have a great day.